Morning, Jeanette. We're going to give it just a few more minutes to see if anybody else jumps on. If not, it could be a really quick call today.
That's fine with me.
While
But
we're waiting,
hopefully someone else will come on.
yeah, while we're waiting, do you have any questions or concerns specifically for you that we can talk about?
Um, believe it or not at this time.
I guess
Everything's going good.
that's a good thing. That's usually a good thing if there's no problems going on.
Yeah, it's fine. Though I was just curious about that listing because I've been watching that listing in Hiram from the day it's listed because it was listed too high.
Yeah.
And he had called me and asked me about my listing, and anyways, he was like trying to tell me that I listed my home wrong, but mine sold way before his. So I was just curious. So I ended up taking it off the market and then putting it back on, and it showed up as a new listing. Like, how did you do that? It had only been off the market like a week.
Yeah, I don't know the scenario behind it because from my understanding, and maybe Russ, you know something different. My understanding is the only way to reset the days on market is to be off the market for 30 days or to be relisted in a different brokerage. So I don't
It
know.
was under contract before it got, and then it was under contract and then it was canceled. So I don't know if maybe while it was under contract, they were considering that off the market is the only thing I can think.
Yeah, because then it would come back as, so it went under contract on like day one or day zero.
No, it was on the market for a really long time. But it had been under contract. I don't know how many days. I'd have to look it up again. But obviously the contract failed, and when it failed, they canceled it. And then a week later, they put it back on, and that's when it came on as a new listing. So I'm wondering if they count the days where it's under contract as being off market. I don't know.
Yeah, that I don't know. I just knew of those two scenarios that they would reset. So they're trying to avoid what a lot of agents would do is they would cancel and then relist it on a different MLS number and it would be zero. So they were trying to eliminate that. So I don't know
It
that.
seems like it's the same MLS number, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I don't know.
Just curious. Yeah,
Awesome.
I'm not gonna worry about it.
Okay. Rich or Chris, do you guys have any specific questions before I jump into what I have today?
I do not.
Okay.
I don't. Just here for the ride, guys.
Perfect. Welcome. Welcome. It looks like normally we will at least have 8 people on here, but we got a small group, but this will be good. So make sure, because what we're talking about today, make sure you let other agents know, because my guess is the reason they're not on the call is probably the same reason we're having some of these problems. They're busy doing other things. So so here's the scenario. I want to go through a couple of our responsibilities and kind of, I don't want to be like, I'm just going to say it how it is. Sometimes it sounds a little bit harsh, but we've had in the last couple of weeks, people that are agents in the company forgetting about things in their contract, going through dates, not realizing it, and they're coming up with reasons, and there's reasons behind what they're doing. They're not just sitting around forgetting about it. But Russ and I had a conversation a couple of months ago, well, probably earlier in the first of this year, with an attorney. We had a transaction in our office that we were getting sued over because of a couple of different issues. But one issue in particular was our agent missed the due diligence deadline and then canceled a day or two after the due diligence deadline based on due diligence. And what ultimately has been happening is the seller sued the buyer, and the buyer might actually lose. And because the buyer is going to lose, the buyer is now suing the agent because the agent missed the deadline. So when we were talking to this attorney, the interesting thing was it was a really simple statement, but he says, you guys are in a professional industry. and blowing through a date or missing a date is going to be 100% responsibility on the agent that's in charge. And so when we get a listing agreement or we get a buyer broker agreement, they're agreeing that we are their agent. We are working on their behalf. And so it is our responsibility to make sure things happen in contracts. We can't use excuses. And so this is the part that I'm going to bring up. It sometimes it can sound a little bit harsh, but it doesn't really matter if you are the agent and in your life things happen like a death, you're sick, you have mental challenge going on right now, there's a tragedy, there's something that like legitimately is something that's going on in your life, which George has talked a lot, and Russ and I have kind of mentioned it as well, that most people you meet are going through some really tough times. So the chances of that the 6 of us on the call right now, that one of you or all of you are going through some really challenging times right now is not lost on us. There is some challenging times. However, this is what I want to make sure you guys understand. If you're an agent for someone else, it's your responsibility to make sure things get done. It's your responsibility to make sure that we're on top of the dates. It's your responsibility to make sure that when the seller's disclosure deadlines comes, that everything is done, everything is filled out the way it's supposed to, and it's sent on. And that's where you have to look at it and say, if something's going on in your life, that's okay. You've got to reach out to another agent. You've got to reach out to somebody who can help you in the company. So it's a really good idea for you guys to, connect with another agent and just say, hey, if I've got things going on, I'll help. Can you help me? And if you got things going on, I'm going to help you. Really a good practice to do, because we all want to go on vacation. We all want to disconnect from our phone. But as a professional, if I choose to disconnect from my phone, let's say that I go on a cruise, nothing's happening. I have a listing that's going on, nothing's happening. And then I just think, oh, I'm going to be just gone for 5 days. I don't have my phone, not a big deal. Something happens in those 5 days, nobody can get a hold of you. Then all of a sudden the problem escalates really quickly. And I can tell you that when a client, you guys have probably all experienced this, when a client of yours is having a question or a problem, if they can't get a hold of you instantly, that problem automatically starts to go up and gets more and more of a problem. I was going to share an experience. I had an experience with a buyer that I worked with. This is probably about 10 years ago now. So I've learned from my mistakes. But in this particular case, we went under contract on a Wednesday, and I said, okay, we're under contract. We got 2 weeks for due diligence. I told him, I said, hey, I'm going to be out of town for 24 hours with no cell service. I went down to the Great Basin, and at that time there was no cell service down there. The seller's agent sent over an addendum that said they wanted to change our financing appraisal deadline by 1 day so that they could accommodate something they were doing. Now, it was not a big problem. It was not a problem at all. In fact, it was just as easy. I put a date on there and said, okay, 1 day is not a big deal. However, I didn't get that. My buyer got that. And by the time I got back into cell service that Saturday afternoon, so I left Friday around noon, I got back in town Saturday around noon. By the time there, I had 5 messages, and my client was wanting to cancel the contract. And so obviously I called them up and I said, what's going on? And they said, they're trying to pull a fast one on us. They're taking advantage of us and all of this stuff. And really what it came down to was, no, actually, it's just fine. We'll adjust what we need to do and we'll make it happen. And it will change nothing for you guys. But she had spent that entire night. She was very high emotion, and she didn't sleep at all that 24 hours. And if I would have had an agent who would have stepped up and said, oh, not a big deal, we'll take care of this as soon as Jason gets back, she would have slept fine. We wouldn't have had a problem. And we ended up going through the transaction. It was fine, but that would have saved her 24 hours of high levels of stress. So I bring that up because, especially during this time of the year when some of us will take off a little bit of time here and there, or, we'll get caught up in really busy, or, maybe you'll get sick or something. You've got to make sure you don't miss your deadlines. We had one today that their seller's disclosure deadline is today, and they're working with a transaction coordinator, and that transaction coordinator has been asking and asking for the seller's disclosures and still has not got them to this day. And then they call the agent and call the agent and call the agent. They ended up not being able to get a hold of the agent until just this morning. And there was a lot of stress that was involved there. And the agent says, which I don't doubt it, says there's been a lot going on in his life. He just wants to make sure that, he just had things he had to take care of. It's our responsibility. That's where I don't want to be too harsh, but I also want you guys to understand you are the professional. You will get the lawsuit against you if your life takes precedence over your client. Does anyone have any questions about that specifically? Hopefully that was clear.
And I've got a question. I think,
Sure.
Jason, I guess concern is, at what point are the deadlines the client's responsibility to remember? I mean, it's our responsibility to let them know of that, but like, thanks. At what point do we, have we done our job and letting them know their responsibility? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And you can go back to the seller's disclosure and say, I've given them to them 4 times. They've not returned them. They're not getting to me. So what I would do in that situation is, you do not control what your client does. If your client doesn't bring in their earnest money, or they don't do certain things in the time that you give them, it's not going to be on you. What's going to be on you is if you don't give them the heads up, if you don't have if I haven't got a hold of them to get the deadlines, I want to make sure I've got an email that says plenty time advance. Hey, we're coming up on this deadline. Is there anything that you need me to do? Are we okay to move forward? And then if you don't hear anything, okay, I'm proceeding as we've talked before based on our last conversation. So that if they ever came back to you and said, you never told me about this deadline, which, when anything gets really tense, our memories go out the door. We forget things. And so when your client calls up and says, they never told me it, and then I call you, Rich, and you say, I told them like 10 times, but you don't have anything to prove to say, yeah, I actually did talk to them, or I actually have that. That's where you get into trouble. So yes, you have the responsibility, but no, you don't have the responsibility you just have the responsibility to make sure they are aware of it.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, they signed the contract. It's there. The date is there. So I'm not saying what we shouldn't, follow up and be more communicative, always be there. But at what point can we just say, well, you signed this contract, both parties have signed it. The dates are there. You have access to that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I just I don't want to be responsible for us doing what we were supposed to do, and then them coming back saying, well, you didn't tell us the due diligence deadline. Well, you knew it. You signed it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And
Can I say something?
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree with Rich that we do give them the contract and they have a copy of that. But I think we also have to take the approach that a lot of times the buyers or sellers, they don't have as much experience and they don't do this every day. So I think we have to take the responsibility that even though they have it, that it is our responsibility to make sure those things are getting done and they're aware of it. And, whatever that takes, I think you have to figure that out as yourself. But I think constant communication and just taking that upper hand that this is what we do every day, but it's not something, sometimes they don't even really understand the contract. So we just need to take that approach.
I agree 100%. I just, in the event something goes to a court and a judge is saying, hey, what's going on here? Well, hey, they did sign it. And, I don't want the judge to say, well, Jason, you should have told them, even though they signed it. You know what I mean? I guess that's my only thing. I think.
Yeah,
I
and
think
honestly, we
some
would
on
love,
us.
yeah, we would love for the client to take more responsibility for it. And that was one of the ahas I had when we were talking to this attorney is there's two parties to this contract. You've got their buyer and you got the agent that's involved. One of them has a professional license, one of them does not. And the judge is going to look at it differently based on who has the professional license. So when it comes to, yes, you have the contract, yes, you signed the contract, as long as you as an agent are doing what you need to do as far as effort in making sure things happen. Okay, so let's take due diligence deadline, for example. Okay, it's in the contract. The buyer knows there's a due diligence coming up. Now I leave out of town for 3 days, and right in the middle of my vacation is the due diligence deadline. I come back and the client says, hey, you didn't tell me I could cancel. And you say, well, it's in the contract. It says the date. You've got to be really careful with, okay, where were you? What were you doing as an agent? And were you the agent for them or were you doing something else? That's where this conversation gets really sticky. Go ahead.
Yeah, right. I agree, Jason. And it's not just on the day of the deadline date. It is what has preceded within the 10, 15 days before that date. Are you informing them, maybe twice a week, once a week, hey, this deadline's coming up, don't forget this deadline, check in again if you haven't heard anything. Okay, second time this week on a Friday, okay, this week, remember we have this deadline, what's going, it doesn't start, your problems don't begin on the day of the deadline. It's what have I done consistently up until that deadline.
Yeah, and so to cover ourselves, and I guess that's why we're here, right? Do we send out a separate checklist, and do we continue to send that checklist out? Hey, we're here, now we're here, now we're here. I guess that's
of
probably
course.
Maybe the
yeah, I mean that's
right.
the safest way to do it is do some checklist. I just like to send something in writing that says, hey, I just want to make sure, Rich, today is our due diligence deadline at 5 p.m. tonight. Is there anything specific you need me to take care of before we pass this deadline? And ideally, I want to make sure that I've given them enough time to respond to that. And then that's what I'm going to keep. I'm going to keep that into my file. So if it ever came back and said, they didn't tell me. And in this particular case, when you talk about the due diligence deadline, if they wanted to cancel and they cancel off the due diligence and it was a couple days late, they're not going to come back and say, oh, I remember the deadline and we did it late. I just said, oh, he told me I could do it off the due diligence. And so we canceled. And you've got to have things to, one, back up what you're saying, because as a professional, if we're going into a court situation and it's my word against the client's word, and I'm the one with the professional, and I have nothing to back it up, no emails, no text messages, nothing to back it up, it's actually going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt the client from them saying it to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think note taken. I think sometimes me personally, I have kind of an assistant that does a lot of that, but do they? You know what I mean? So I think it's something I love this conversation, so I can maybe implement more communication on the dates.
Yeah,
Well,
there
and
comes
Jason,
balances for us as agents is what we're looking at. Because the reason we bring this up is in the last week, we've had at least 3 situations that I'm aware of where agents had something going on and they missed things that they should have, not necessarily missed deadlines like the due diligence one. That's a little bit more strict, but like we have the seller's disclosure stuff. I didn't get this on time. We had an earnest money check that was supposedly cashed or put in to the account in 4 days when like it was supposed to, but then we get 2 weeks into it and we find out that the earnest money hasn't even come in yet, and that agent hadn't informed the seller who they represented that earnest money wasn't deposited. So these are small things that could ultimately become really big things for you in your business, is if we miss them and we don't take a look and say, okay, this is what we've got and this is what we don't have, that will come back on us. And for Rich and for any of you that have assistants, you got to keep in mind that your assistant represents you. So whatever they do represents your actions. So you want to make sure they're doing things that you would want them to do. And that if they're not checking it as much, you need to step in and make sure that that's part of their
Well,
process.
And Jason, on the lawsuit that Jason was talking to you guys about, the thing that was interesting on the date that was missed on that was they actually did an addendum to extend the appraisal deadline. But then when they sent it over, the seller countered it back, and then they countered the counter, and then the seller countered the counter. And the problem was the agent just forgot that in the meantime of all these counters going back and forth, he did not get that finance and appraisal deadline extended. So then when they couldn't come to an agreement after all these counters back and forth, they were like, all right, well, then we're just canceling, but they were already past their deadline. So.
Yeah. So that's something that happens. But I just want you guys to make sure, especially when you're taking time off, there's nothing wrong with taking time off. Just have somebody checking for you if there's specific dates. I mean, we really only have a couple of like drop dead deadlines in our contracts that like we need to make sure we're doing. Just make sure you have a way of making sure that's checked. And our biggest thing is if we're representing sellers, our biggest deadline that we have to look at is our seller's disclosure deadline. If we're working with our buyers, then our biggest deadlines are due diligence deadline and finance and appraisal deadlines. And then all of us have to deal with the settlement deadline. So those are really like our biggest things. And if we just kind of blow them off, or, hey, I'm having a bad day, I totally forgot about it. In fact, Russ and I were talking to an agent a couple days ago that just, oh, I got busy and I forgot to do it. And it's like, yeah, I understand you're busy, but that's where we need to make sure we step up. So anyway, hopefully that didn't sound like a lecture. None of you guys are the ones I'm talking about. But if you do see somebody who's taking time out, let them know they be diligent, be the professional. So anyway, that's all.
It's a good reminder for all of us, though, to just.
It really is.
Mhm.
I mean, all of these times that we're on compliance, they are so, even though we know some things, it just reinforces some of those things that we know. And sometimes we get things too that we go, oh, I'm really glad I was on today because I didn't know that, so it's always really beneficial. I just wish everybody knew how beneficial it is.
Yeah, well, sometimes we'll bring them up in Summit when they become real problems, but just so you know, most of the topics for the Friday come out of the problems Russ and I deal with through the week. So we talk about it through the week and say, well, this has happened multiple times, so let's talk about it. So I'm glad you guys are on. Any other questions before I jump off?
No, not for me. Thanks, guys.
Yep, next week we won't have the call because we're having the holiday party here in Union Park. So come down if you want. Rich, Chris.
Sounds
yeah,
good.
You guys are all up north, so you guys can all come down to
Yeah.
our party, but we won't have this call.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much.
Well, everybody
Thanks.
have a happy holiday, Merry Christmas, whatever you want to call it, and enjoy yourself.
You too.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for all you
All
do.
right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.